There are lots of different ways of making your own mould box. Some people use thick cardboard held in place with hot glue. Other people use existing tubs which they can pour into. I like to make my own mould boxes from old Lego. Now, because I'm going to be using Lego, I need to make sure that there is a flat base, which is what I'm doing here. Otherwise, what happens is, because the object that I'm going to be making a mould of does not sit directly on a flat surface because of the raised dots on the Lego, then the mould, the silicone will flow underneath it. So I'm just making a flat base here. Now, the good thing about Lego is that you can make a mould box any shape at all that you want. For this particular project, I'm using Moldcraft GP3481 RTV silicone. There's lots of different silicones you can buy. This particular one is just something that I picked up from eBay. There's lots of different types. Moldcraft does 320, 325, 330 and 340. But there's also different companies available as well. This particular silicone has a 10:1 ratio by weight. So basically what I should be doing is measuring out exactly how much of the red catalyst I want, and then measuring out exactly the weight of how much of the white silicone that I want. I could do that using digital scales. However, I normally find that it's perfectly feasible to use it without doing that, and normally I would measure it by volume rather than weight. Here though, you can see I haven't really measured it out at all. That's because I've come to the very end of this particular batch of silicone that I'm using, and so basically I'm just decided to dump what's left of my catalyst into my silicone rubber and just go with that. You can see here that once it's in, you then have to mix it, and the colour is quite good because you can then see with the red and the white, when you get a good mixture, then you have a smooth, consistent colour throughout, and you'll be able to tell when it's all mixed perfectly well. Silicone can be bought in various sizes, but for a small project like this, be looking at something like either the 275 gram pack, which would cost about £5.99, or the 550 gram pack, which would be about £11.99. Once it's all stirred and it's ready and you've got a good consistent colour, it's then time to pour the mould. When you're trying to pour the mould, try to get the silicone to go into the space around the object. It's better not trying to pour directly onto the object itself, because that way you're more likely to trap air bubbles. You want a long, slow pour, and basically the higher you can pour from, the better, because as you can see, there's lots of air bubbles in the silicone which will not make a good mould. But if you pour it high and get a long string, then those air bubbles will start to burst on the way down. You want a nice slow pour, so that basically you're trying to get rid of as many air bubbles as you possibly can, because if you get air bubbles in your finished mould, those will act as little pockets which resin will go into, and if resin goes into those and then dries, you will end up with what is known as boogers, which will be little balls of resin on the surface of your sculpt, which will spoil it really and have to be cut off and sanded and tidied up. So if you can avoid that at all, then that's what we want to do, so we get a nice good cast so that we've got no air bubbles at all. You can see here we're getting to the end of the stream, so just going to finish up with this cast, and we don't want it to go everywhere. We've definitely covered the object that we were going to cast, and we've got a good layer of silicone all the way around it. We don't want the walls of the silicone mould to be too thin, otherwise they will rip easily, but at the same time we also don't want them to be too thick, because in that case you are wasting silicone, and it's not a particularly cheap material. Now, as I said, we really don't want air bubbles trapped in the silicone for this mould, so what I'm doing here is obviously moving the mould block around from side to side to try and move any air bubbles that might be trapped on the surface of the object that we're casting, just to try and dislodge them slightly. That's also why I'm tapping on the sides, moving it around, tapping on all the sides, and that will help to dislodge any air bubbles which might be on the surface of the object that you want to make a cast of, and they will eventually slowly float up to the surface and pop, and you'll get a nice cast. Once it's been left for a few hours, that will be completely dry and cured. Now, the manufacturers recommend between 8 and 12 hours. However, I find that it's normally worked in about 2 to 3. However, the longer you leave it, the less chance of there being any problems when you take it apart. So I would just leave it to cure for as long as you can. Now, again, with a Lego mould box, it's very easy to dismantle everything, and you can get your silicone block out nice and easily. And one of the good things with this way of doing it is that you can reuse the Lego again and again, whereas with cardboard boxes and hot glue, you've got one shot at it and then that's it done. Now, I also like my silicone moulds to look nice and neat and tidy. This step here, obviously, it has no actual functional purpose. It will not affect the outcome of the resin casts, but it makes it look much nicer, and I find that these silicone moulds will stick around and they can be used for years. I've actually got some silicone moulds that I've had for several years and they're still good, so if they're looked after carefully, you can use them time and time again. You can see here the little piece of plastic that I blue tacked onto the bottom of the object that I was going to cast has also made it much easier to get it out at the very end, and I'm just using a hobby knife here just to slice off those bits because it'll be nice and smooth and easy to get rid of them. Now, what I've made here is obviously a very, very simple one-part mould. Professionals will make multi-part moulds, or at very least two-part moulds, but for something quick and simple I like to use just a one-part mould. Now, this will only really work on objects that do not have sharp intakes or undercuts or extra pieces hanging off of them, but objects which are basically one single shape or one single piece, this works quite well at. Of course, once you've made your one-piece mould, you will then have to remove the object from the mould, and I find that I have to cut it out very carefully. But due to the nature of the silicone, then it's almost self-healing, so that once you've removed the object and put it back together, it can be almost impossible to tell where the cut was. You can see inside it's captured all the detail, and once I press it back together, it holds it really well.